All right. All right. Okay. All righty. Sorry for the delay. I think I'd be more, but we're in the classroom again, Kareem. And hopefully we will, have you guys heard if the mask ordinance is going to be lifted?
Yeah.
When is that going to be?
Monday.
Monday. So this is huge. We have not been in person without masks since it would have been March of 2020. So, and you guys would have been maybe in high school. So this is your first time in a couple days, it'll be the first time they have college in person without masks. Let's hope it lasts. I am so privileged, and I want you guys, Kareem, I'm going to turn my thing after I talk so that you can see the class here. We have some other students joining us via Zoom, but I am so thankful that you have joined us because 3 months ago we came together to talk about geopolitics and sports and how different it looks. We were talking about Manny Pacquiao being in the front runner of the Philippines presidency. That quickly changed. He's now a distant third or fourth because of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has teamed up with the daughter of Duterte, Sarah Duterte. And so basically the two, I want to say I wouldn't say the most corrupt, but Philippine families have joined together. And so Manny Pacquiao will likely not be a president. The other couple topics that we talked about that I find very interesting is we talked about the buildup on the border of Ukraine of the Russian troops and what that meant. And it was very interesting because I finally learned that Vitaly Klitschko was the mayor of, and I said Kiev at that time. And we discussed it, and I really wanted your insight, Kareem, because I'm like, I didn't even know he became the mayor. And that's crazy. Wow, 3 months later, we're in a very different place. If you've been under a rock, I guess I will just summarize with this, is that Russia has invaded Ukraine. Klitschko, Mayor Klitschko, Vitaly, his brother, Vladimir, have been very open. We also have seen a very interesting thing with using President Zelensky and his tactics against Vladimir Putin, who we discussed. And Kareem, you gave us a really interesting psychological ideology about Putin, which is coming true. Julie, we discussed you've met Putin, and I think your image of him lines up. And yes, we are in a horrific war. And we also have had Vasily Lomachenko, who is the 9th pound for pound fighter, current, professional fighter, has gone back to join the Ukrainian army. We also have Alexander Usyk, who is the 2nd pound per pound boxer in the world, current, I think, cruiser and heavyweight champion. And he has joined the army. And so we have this, we have images of boxers and how they are, part of this war. And I really would love to just dive into it. And Kareem, I don't even think I have to go into your background anymore. You're an esteemed journalist, translator, author. who've done a number of projects for Bloody Elbow and Guardian, HBO Sports. And I would love your insight into all of this. I know that you can kind of unpack the complexity and really help us understand what is going on. One last thing that I definitely want to cover with this discussion is, guess what? Those governmental, I guess they're out of government, government sports agencies, in particular, the Olympic Committee, International Olympic Committee, and FIFA have woken up, unlike where we saw them before. So those are the kind of discussions I'd love to get into. Kareem, can you just let us know your thoughts on these things?
Well, I mean, first thought off the top of my head really is I think it'll be very hard to make a genuine case for the fact that sports do not intersect with politics anymore. I mean, of course, really, what we've seen is it's multi-layered and quite a wide range of ways where now sports and politics absolutely mesh and connect and are inevitable, to say the least, really. Now, we're talking about really, it's hard to even know where to begin. Let's look at Vladimir Putin. Let's look at how sports have helped build up this cult of personality over the past 20 years or so. I mean, nothing that I'd like to really preface by saying what's happening in Ukraine is horrific, it's awful, it's tragic. But with regards to Vladimir Putin, none of this is new. None of this is new. We've seen him apply this exact form of warfare in Chechnya in 1999, where he carpet bombed Grozny. And he did this again in 2008 in Georgia, then again in 2016 in Aleppo in Syria and other places in Syria thereafter. Carpet bombing these cities, absolutely destroying them. I mean, we're seeing even Getty now is putting up these comparison pictures between Ukraine and Syria. Just goes to show you, I mean, the culprit in both those cases is the same person. But throughout this time, all these years and throughout these 3 previous wars, sports had no issue dealing with Putin. I mean, he had already carpet bombed multiple cities by the time Sochi, the Winter Olympics happened in Sochi. And let's not even get into the doping scandal at this point that we're all aware of what happened right after Sochi. Despite that, the Russian Olympic team continued to compete in the Olympics. They faced no legitimate sanctions at that point, showing just how little the world actually cared about these issues. And then you had the FIFA World Cup in 2018. Another massive sports entity going and showing its support and legitimizing his authoritarian regime. And there's just simply no way to deny he's an authoritarian at this point. I mean, many people used to make a case, well, no, Russia's just a different place, etc. I'd say we've even crossed the boundaries from authoritarian into complete totalitarianism at this point. I mean, just look at, here's another example of just how Putin is utilizing sports right now. He's lost the ability to manipulate sports on a global stage just because everybody's turned their back on him right now. I personally think it's too little too late. But just look at today, he bussed in paid supporters to fill the Olympic stadium that the 2018 World Cup final took place in. This happened today. I mean, there are pictures and videos all over the internet, and he gave this big speech in front of thousands of people and these Russian flags flying. There was a concert thereafter. All this happened in the stadium where the World Cup final, the most recent World Cup final, took place. I mean, there really is nothing at this point to deny the intersection of sports and politics. I can no longer hear any legitimate cases for such a thing. And I think, despite the fact that sports have turned their back on Putin, everybody's going to have to take a very good hard look in the mirror and realize that they were all part of this. It's too little too late now. It's the same as applying the sanctions. That could have been useful months ago. I'd say even as recently as 6 months ago, they might have had more impact than they're going to have now. And I'm talking about the economic sanctions, let alone the sports sanctions. The sports sanctions, I would say, yes, necessary in the sense that you do need to eliminate any source of state profit or prestige in the sporting world that has to do with Russia. But at the same time, where was everybody all these years ago? Where was everybody over the past 20 years? It sounds like a rhetorical question at this point, but honestly, I'd still love to know, why are we all still engaging in this performative theater? What about all the other authoritarian countries? At the end of the day, Ukraine, what's happening is awful. It's not the only war right now. Yemen is being bombed as well, yet nobody's contemplating removing Saudi from the picture. So even right now, even with the fact that people are finally facing the intersection of sports and politics, they're still doing it through a lens of Western exceptionalism. So this is a great start, but we've got a long way to go before we make up for all the catastrophes that we've already committed.
There's so much I'm interested because you say these sanctions, they could have done them before. And especially I'm interested in the sports sanctions. The Russian oligarchs, you had mentioned them before. How I know that one of them was the former owner of Chelsea. Now, for me, I'm also curious, how is putting pressure on them going to affect the Putin and what he's doing?
So I think personally, from studying Russia over the past few years and spending plenty of time in Russia and covering quite a few of these Russian oligarchs, I think sometimes we overestimate the influence they have in Putin's inner circle. And I think right now, where even the most avid Russia watchers and the most intellectual of scholars on the topic never really expected Putin to go this far, because they believed there was an inner circle that could rein him in. They believed at the end of the day he would listen to reason, or at least their interpretation of reason. I think the last few weeks have shown that the oligarchs, let alone his actual cabinet and inner circle, have very little influence over what Putin does or is willing to do. So again, Russian sanctions and sanctions against Roman Abramovich, the former owner of Chelsea, or actually he's still the owner of Chelsea. Chelsea hasn't sold technically yet, but sanctions against him might have been useful. I mean, he's owned Chelsea since what, 2004, 2003, 2004. He's the one who started this whole let's buy up, like billionaires buying up and states buying up football clubs in the first place. So really, I think sanctions could have happened a long time ago and they would have had an impact, because Roman Abramovich used buying Chelsea as a way to boost his own standing in Russia, his own influence in Russia, and brought him much closer to Putin in the first place. You want to talk about somebody who could have had impact? It could have been all that time. Really, yeah. Adding those sanctions could have changed a lot then. Right now, it's pressuring, it's throwing pressure on an oligarch that all he can do is run and hide. He cannot go to Putin and say time to stop this war, and Putin's not going to listen to him at this point. So again, it is necessary action because it should have been taken years ago. But at the same time, if you're expecting any fallout or consequences, I'm here to tell you that's not going to happen from simply banning Roman Abramovich or sanctioning him. It's a start, but we're missing key sanctions. I mean, just to quickly note something that's off the sports world, just the idea that economic sanctions have to be very deliberate and have to be very specific. And sure, targeting Roman Abramovich is a very specific name, but at the end of the day, that's not the key issue right now. They're not targeting the main banks in Russia, and they're still not targeting really natural gas and stuff like that. Gazprom, which is one of Russia's like giant natural gas and oil exporters, is still very active in Russia, and so is its media entity. And through there, and Gazprom media was well known for spreading propaganda and buying up all of Russia's newspapers. I mean, the reason we see Russia as such an authoritarian place right now, and a place where there's no free speech and no press freedom whatsoever, is partly because of Gazprom, which is not facing sanctions. So really, we've got this whole strange performative theater really going on right now, where the sanctions that do exist aren't targeting the right people. And it's almost like people are going back through all these old articles people have written. Oh, we should have sanctioned Abramovich a while ago. Oh, we might as well put him on the list now. Great, he's on the list finally, but I mean, what are you expecting now?
And so now, what I'm so curious what you think of, because it looks like the train's already out there, and that I'm very curious because you obviously know a lot about Kadyrov and Chechnya and how he prepares his soldiers. We've been talking a lot about the Russian army, and this is something, and I don't know if it's kind of the West media's way of reassuring or saying that, well, this Russian army is not prepared, or they don't know what their mission is. Can you give us insight into that?
With regards to Ramzan Kadyrov, here's what I can say is how his troops are utilized. First, let's to give your class some background, some very quick background here. Is Chechnya is a once independent republic in the North Caucasus region of southwestern Russia that has been under Russian control since about 1859. So since the Russian Empire, this is a place that's always wanted to be free. These people are not Russian, as contrary to anything Putin or Kadyrov right now will say. People from Chechnya, from Dagestan, etc., they do not consider themselves Russian. They are independent and rightfully so. And as of right now, they are occupied states. So moving on from there, Kadyrov took power in about 2007. He was installed by Putin after two Chechen wars and after Kadyrov's father was assassinated. So really, he comes under power under Putin. And Kadyrov branded himself as a patron of sports from the very beginning. His passions range from equestrian to soccer, combat sports. Primary focus really was mixed martial arts. He went so far as popularizing the sport in Chechnya and elevating Chechen fighters to elite social statuses, creating structured facilities and infrastructure for people to train in, and really elevating it to a part of actual Chechen manhood. And now this takes us back to how he creates this sort of cult of personality for himself, how he utilizes sports like mixed martial arts to instill this idea that a true Chechen man is a fighter. And through that, he also connects you to, if you're not going to fight professionally, you're going to be a soldier on my battlefield. So really, the ideal Chechen for a person like Kadyrov is somebody who's going to be either a soldier, especially a Chechen man at this point. He's got a whole other set of ideals for women. And really, that's a whole, that can be its own course at this point. But for the Chechen man, his ideals are either you're going to be a professional fighter or you're going to be a professional soldier. And we see that connection. Let's just take a look at his fight club. His fight club is called Ahmed MMA, and there are multiple ones. And it also includes an actual fight league itself, like an MMA promotion. But let's just stick to the title of Ahmed MMA for the whole thing. Ahmed MMA is run by a man named Abu Zayed Vismuradov. And Vismuradov's nickname, he goes by the nickname or the nom de guerre of Patriot. I mean, right there, you're signaling just the status of this human being. He's extremely loyal to Kadyrov. Now, this is a man who fought in both Chechen wars with Kadyrov, is from the exact same clan and village and grew up with Kadyrov, considered his absolute right-hand man, and has so much blood on his hands that I think it's impossible at this point to count how many people he has killed and how many people he has purged from Chechnya. Truly one of the most horrific people. He's also in charge of Kadyrov's SWAT team. He's in charge of the Kadyrovtsi, and he's in charge of Kadyrov's actual personal bodyguards. So this is a man with extreme power, and he's got true military might in Chechnya, and he just so happens to run their fight club. So really the connections between the fight club and Kadyrov's government, and more so his military, are undeniable. And now we look at the fact that a few weeks ago, Kadyrov announces that he was about to send 12,000 Chechen troops to fight in Ukraine, of course, for Putin. This is, again, a quick note is that not all the Chechens, first of all, not all Chechens like Kadyrov. As a matter of fact, most of them have very little that they can do about it. He's committed such a wide range of human rights abuses, including assassinations, abductions, etc., that people are unable to speak up for themselves. So I'd like to say that instead of using the term Chechen troops, I'm going to refer to them as Kadyrov's troops here, because really it's unfair to most of Chechnya. It's unfair to the vast majority of people who don't want anything to do with this war. It's also unfair to the Chechens who are fighting on Ukraine's side right now, because there are also those that I haven't mentioned yet. So you now have 12,000 of Kadyrov's troops. So that's the number that he says. Even I've watched all the videos and I put them closer to 4,000 or so. Still, thousands of them being sent off to fight in Ukraine. And all those propaganda videos are really something to marvel. And that now brings you back to Putin. His main interest after subjugating Chechnya, mind you, he carpet bombed the city in 1999. And by 2007, he's got a great warlord in charge of the place. And now he's got this feeding system or farming system for soldiers that can just come into his own army when he wants to invade elsewhere. So Putin not only destroyed this republic and brought it back under Russian control, he's using their people as cannon fodder at the end of the day. Why? Because the average Russian's not going to care so much if a Chechen dies. That's just the truth of it. Russia celebrated Putin's military campaigns, as he likes to call them, in Chechnya in 1999. When he was using chemical weapons in Chechnya, when he was carpet bombing the city, they celebrated it because they thought Chechens were terrorists. They weren't white like them. They were terrorists to them. So this is also something very important to keep in mind. Right now, you've got a warlord in Kadyrov, a warlord that's still widely respected in sports, despite being sanctioned, who's sending subjugated Chechens to fight a war that they want nothing to do with in Ukraine, and he's doing this after feeding them all this garbage about being an ideal Chechen person and being a professional fighter at the same time. The connections are undeniable, they're insidious, they're disgusting, and I have a lot of writing to do, to say the least. This war has resurfaced this topic in a way that even I, having covered Kadyrov for about 8 years now, never thought it would reach this degree, truly.
Does he represent that? So that's the Chetnian model, which sadly could be the precursor of what happens to Ukraine, where he sets up a warlord. I mean, is that, what is the other part of the Russian army like? Is it also kind of regional, where they have a Kadyrov-like figure who's rallying and creating these systems, or is it?
No, the Russian army, I mean, Russia's such a big, vast country, really, right, with such a wide range of ethnicities. So the army tends to be made up of a variety of ethnicities, including people from the North Caucasus and from elsewhere in Russia. But the Russian army is the Russian army. Everything, even those fighting from, say, Dagestan or North Ossetia or something like that, or Ingushetia, all these neighboring republics to Chechnya, they're all fighting as part of the Russian army, per se. Kadyrov's troops, on the other hand, actually have their own titles. They are the Kadyrovtsi. The Kadyrovtsi is Kadyrov's private army. I should have actually made this a bit clearer. His troops are not Russian troops. They are his private army. He is the only such figure in Russia. He is a true warlord in the sense that he has his own private army. This private army once belonged to his father. These were his father's troops, and he became in charge of those troops when his father took over the country. His father was assassinated a year later, and Kadyrov had this group of 5,000 very, very loyal militiamen on his side, and he just kept expanding that group. And now having now such huge military power in Chechnya and a massive budget coming from the Kremlin, he's only expanded those troops. All of them, at the end of the day, are loyal to Kadyrov, not to Russia, and certainly not to Putin. And that's very terrifying, considering what could potentially happen. It's one of the questions I get asked regularly: is Kadyrov dead if Putin dies, or does Kadyrov rise to power? And I don't think I have a answer I'm comfortable with yet. I'm not content with what I'm coming up with at the moment. So basically, I'm still lost on that one.
Yeah, very scary to think, though, of that kind of him. That he has his own army, he has his own agenda. It does make me realize, though, that the Russian army might be fractured, and what we're being told. To go back to the Ukrainian boxers, and I think there's also a football player who's come back, and I think we all know that if you were a male 16 to 60, you were not allowed to leave the country. So very much, I'm curious, what do you think of Ukraine and what Zelensky and the Klitschko's, what are they trying to do? Because I see it as this warrior. I think we mentioned, even just how Zelensky is dressed in a t-shirt and military colors, obviously in great contrast to Putin in his suits. Can you expand on what's going on in that aspect?
I really sometimes wonder, there's a reason I haven't written so much about it, is that I wonder how much it really ties back to sports at the end of the day. I understand that these boxers and these football players, these athletes are going back, but there's also plenty of other Ukrainians that are going back to go and fight. At the end of the day, they're defending their country. I can understand that. I mean, not war sense, but I mean, Egypt went through a revolution. I was part of that, and there's a different. When you think there's a chance for change, you'll go to extents you didn't think you would. Or so I can imagine, having not been in a war myself, that war brings you to all sorts of desperate places, and this is one of them. There are many countries that could have potentially surrendered or not pushed forward, but clearly Ukraine had something to prove. First of all, they had something to prove with regards to their own identity, with regards to their own nationalism, with regards to they have an enemy ahead of them who's actually bombarding their country. It's a horrible, tragic situation that leaves very little option. At the end of the day, I never want to celebrate a situation where you are forcibly being conscripted, right? We are romanticizing something that is truly very tragic. The idea that these young people are now going to go and die. I'm seeing people celebrating the pictures of, the couples getting married and going out to war. We should be crying over that, not celebrating it. I think people really are misunderstanding the situation here. These aren't celebratory moments. These are very, very sad, tragic moments that should not be happening, and they're happening because of Putin right now. That's why they're happening. Klitschko, I'll have to admit, there have been, and I'm sure a lot of other Ukrainians will admit this too, there has been lots of criticism over Klitschko. We talked about him in detail the last time I was on. Same with Zelensky, actually, and the fact that they actually didn't get along in the first place. You see how they've all rallied together, and how they're putting out these very emotionally charged messages, which by all means is exactly in their right to do so. It's in their right to present this. It's in their right to pressure the international community. They're watching their country crumble. So of course they're going to take all these steps. Like there's no doubt about it. But I see people online making this comparison or this connection to, look at this man. He's a boxer. He could have been. He's so wealthy. He could have done anything with his life, but he chose to come back and do and fight here. But there's plenty of other Ukrainians who are also in fantastic positions who chose to come back and do the same thing. Klitschko, I don't think, wants to distinguish himself at this point, and I don't think a sports comparison here really does justice to the entire situation. That's me personally. I understand people are going to want to put these stories up and people are going to want to write about this, and that Klitschko deserves the coverage at this point. He is acting in the best interest of his country. He is extremely courageous right now, and this obviously applies to Zelensky as well. I'm sticking to really mainly referencing Klitschko because boxer and we're talking about sports here, but this all applies to Zelensky, who, mind you, people really were criticizing beforehand. People weren't guaranteeing that he was going to win the next presidential election, etc. And yet his utter transformation is quite remarkable to behold. But again, it is so sad that we have to watch this. And I think it's a very absurd reality where we're watching him give these very powerful speeches, and the best people are doing are clapping for him. I understand that you can't just ship off to go to war, but it's such a weird situation that, okay, you're going to celebrate this person, but what are you going to do about it exactly? Like, war is a very odd thing, and I think us watching it through social media is not helping us actually disseminate it in any way.
Yeah. I also want to bring up, this isn't about sports, but, and you've, I think, posted about this, the courage of the Russians. I think it's over 6,000 who've protested and been incarcerated, which is very scary to do. What kind, and that's a different war that we're trying to win.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that playing out?
So I definitely wanted to reference Russia because I spent a lot of time in Russia and I have friends in Russia, and immediately what I wanted to do was to check on what was going on and how they felt, because I remember I was in Russia in 2014, very shortly after Putin annexed Crimea. That was the very first time I set foot in St. Petersburg, and it was a hot topic that people wanted to discuss. And I was asking people because I had no idea. At that point, I was completely new to the scene. I knew nothing, barely knew anything about journalism, let alone Russia at that point. But everybody that was around me made this case that, listen, we don't want conflict with Ukraine. We don't want this. We don't like what's going on. But what can we say? What can we do? That was really the reaction that I got from a lot of people, is what can we do? What can we really do about this? And that sense of despair I found very familiar because I come from Egypt. And I understand what it's like to live in an authoritarian state. I understand what it's like to feel like you have no say and that you can't really change what your government's doing. Your government's faking your elections. Your government's faking, like this. There's no actual press, and the press that exists, they keep them so pressurized and so oppressed that you're barely getting the information that you need in the first place. And there's so much propaganda from state media that's just buying up more and more of these outlets. So Russia was in a bad way from 2014 when I was there, but the people were wonderful. And that's why I was putting out those tweets saying, listen, there are people taking to the streets in Russia now where you're going to get arrested and you will go to jail for protesting. Like, it's possible. I mean, some people won't go to jail, some people will, but there is an up to right now 15-year sentence for disagreeing with this war. Or for even calling it a war. That is horrific behavior, and that's what happens in Russia. And the fact that people are still taken to the street is something that should be, if not celebrated, noted, appreciated, and understood. And I think when people say things like, well, I expect if here's one thing that would always show up on Twitter, and it was usually quite prominent Twitter accounts that would be posting statements like this would be, well, if every Russian took to the street, they'd end up overthrowing Putin. First of all, that's not how revolutions work. And only somebody with extreme privilege who has never lived a day out in discomfort could ever potentially say something like that. That ignorant, truly. As someone who has gone through a revolution, I can tell you they don't happen that way. That's just not how it happens. And you don't want that. That's not what you want. You don't want a Russia flipped upside down like that. That's not, the turmoil like that does not help anything either. It's not going to suddenly stop the war and make everything good and put those buildings back together. So pushing Russians out onto the street and getting them to put themselves more at risk only sends them in the direction of Putin. You're only polarizing people more. And that's the same thing with the sanctions that are being applied in general. When you have people targeting Russian athletes, like in Wimbledon, I think there's a whole controversy right now about the Russian athlete who they're trying to say must denounce the war or else he can't compete. What is this targeting individuals that have nothing to do with the end result here? How is this going to impact Putin? How is targeting the individuals doing anything other than demeaning them and polarizing them when potentially they can't speak out? Let's take it to a bigger example of Alexander Ovechkin in the NHL. When the media just surrounded him, and I'm one of those ones who would ask questions like that, but in the right setting. That is not the right setting. When the media surrounds a star like that, who, mind you, yes, campaigned for Putin, and it should absolutely be noted that this is a man who created something called Putin Team during Putin's last election, just gathering all these celebrities and athletes and campaigning for Putin. So yes, he should absolutely be criticized for all that. But what were you expecting sitting at a press conference in the early days of the war and expecting him to put out an anti-war statement? First of all, what does it change right then and there? And second of all, this man has family in Russia. And in an authoritarian country, even the best of them can't be protected. It's really that simple. And he actually referenced it 3 times in that interview, saying, I have family in Russia. And the media still didn't get it. And I thought that was just very cringeworthy as I was watching and very upsetting to me. And we're in that time, unfortunately, right now. This is a state of war. People are very, very emotionally tense. But I think we're handling this the wrong way. There are very specific sanctions. There are very specific people that should be targeted, yet we're going the other way about it. So it's really disappointing.
So what are those sanctions we should be targeting? The people who surround Putin? Or because you're saying the sanctions that we're doing now are just going to hurt the Russian people more?
Well, yeah.
Not going to be as effective.
Some of it's unavoidable. Some of the economic sanctions are going to hurt the Russian people, but it's unavoidable because you're trying to implement economic sanctions, but you're not targeting Russian gas right now, and Russian gas should be targeted, but you're not targeting because most of Europe relies on Russian gas. So putting in other performative sanctions that only hurt the people, the way the United States has done to Iran all this time, does not change anything. The Iranian government is still god-awful, and the Iranian people are still wonderful, but they're suffering. Yeah. That doesn't help anybody. It hasn't helped anybody. And yet nobody seems to complain about that case. And now we're trying to see the same thing happen to Russia. It doesn't change anything. It will only make Russia a worse place in 10 years and will only increase our own problems years out. So yes, absolutely. Target Putin. First of all, target the wealthiest of the wealthy in Dubai right now. The Russians hiding out in Dubai, which is a safe haven for Russian oligarchs. Target the ones in London, because London certainly is more than happy to put sanctions on the unavoidable ones like Roman Abramovich, but there's plenty others that have homes and yachts in London and all sorts of things. Well, not the yachts per se, but you get what I'm saying. All these luxury houses and goods, etc. All these things are around them in London and places like Dubai, etc. But people aren't targeting those things. Those are the people that should be targeted. Those are the people that absolutely will likely pressure Putin still, even in this situation right now where he's listening to nobody. Your best hope is still his inner circle. And it's still the corporate environment around him being the Russian gas like Gazprom. Gazprom has not been sanctioned. I repeat this again because I cannot believe it to this day. It is the easiest target right there, and it's not been sanctioned. With sports, sorry, one last point. With sports, it's the same thing, really. Targeting the individual athletes changes nothing, but banishing Russia from things like the World Cup does remove state prestige from someone like Vladimir Putin. He has relied on it for 20 years. It is still a step that should be taken. Unfortunately, this means that the athletes who had nothing to do with this suffer as well, but it also means that an actual state-controlled entity, being the Russian football team and the Russian association, a football association, cannot be involved in major international sports, cannot gain that prestige. The same should apply to Ramzan Kadyrov and any of his fighters who still compete in the UFC and headline fight cards in the UFC to this day, even though Ahmed MMA is sanctioned in the United States. It is sanctioned in the United States already. Yet despite that, they still compete there. These are people who are bringing back all sorts of, influence and prestige to Ramzan Kadyrov. This is sports washing in action. If it's not sports washing, ignore it. If it is sports washing, that's what you should be targeting. People still aren't targeting the right things.
No, it is unbelievable. If we have Kadyrov's army, his troops, we know that they're actually involved in some of this invasion and war crimes. If I would hope the UFC Endeavor knows that is just an unconscionable connection. But we, as you know, Kareem, we say, like, how can this happen? How can FIFA allow Qatar to have people mistreated, have their passports taken away? But it is interesting, though. We have had things finally go. It took invading a country and the carpetbagging and missiles. Switzerland is now, for I think its first time, is not being neutral in terms of it is doing sanctions. So that's something. And we do have the banning from the World Cup and the IOC. Now, and other, we see like golf and tennis and some of these other ones, it looks like they're going to maybe make, like you talked about Wimbledon, so it'll be like this individual thing. Why is that such a big deal that IOC is finally banning? And it took a lot. I mean, I think they actually reversed the Paralympics, which were going on. They may even be going on currently in China. They were going to have them be part of, the neutrality stage, but then they reversed it. What will this do? And, why do you think they finally took these measures?
Unfortunately, I still think they finally took these measures because they had no choice. They saw where the tide of public opinion was turning, and they knew that there was very little that could be done about it rather than actually taking action against Russia. And considering they had already taken specific action against Russia up until that point, it was inevitable that this was the next stage. But they're doing this while also holding the Olympics in an authoritarian regime, being China. So the hypocrisy is laughable. Really, it's ridiculous. Yeah. So again, it's very hard for me to take any of these sports institutions seriously unless they apply these actions across the board. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because at the end of the day, you can start pinpointing, you can find a way to nitpick probably about every single country in the world. And then where are you going to hold an event? I understand, but there are some key abusive nations here that should not be involved. I think of the Formula One, and the Formula One canceled its Russian Grand Prix in Sochi, which I think I had seen in 2015 when I was in Sochi at the time. And Putin was there and everything. So he loves that Russian Grand Prix. So that's a great step, because Putin loves that event, and it was one of the events he enjoyed going to. And of course, that's more prestige for him and his government, etc. So no Russian Grand Prix. Fantastic. Okay, great. Well, what about, the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix? What about the Bahrain Grand Prix? What about the Azerbaijan, Baku Grand Prix? I mean, you don't have to remove all of the ones on your list, but there are some key abusive monarchies and authoritarian regimes there that should be considered as well. Some of them are actually participating in another war, being the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. If we're trying to make the case right now that Russia is being removed because of actually invading another sovereign country, then how does that not apply to Saudi Arabia invading Yemen? Nobody has given me a good answer to that.
I'm afraid it's a sad answer that is, Western racism and not, identifiable, which is just another horrible thing. I'm, by the way, Julie, please chime in, and Greg, and if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, because I'm so curious, and I asked this last time, Kareem, I'm like, do you think Putin will actually invade Ukraine?
And I was wrong last time when you asked. I said it would be limited to Eastern Ukraine. That was really what I believed, but I think that's what the world believed, really.
I know. Oh, I think we all. But you did know more of the nuances and everything, and you kind of knew that they were going to kind of play off the nationalism, the neo-Nazi, which doesn't make sense at all. How do you see this playing out? And then how do you want it to play out if like Kareem could be there and be, be the legit, the political war czar that we would want you to be?
Wow, I don't know about the war czar. That sounds
not war czar.
like
If you could direct things to go in finally in the tide of good, I guess I'm saying. But how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think there's key nuances that are difficult to discuss right now because we're in a state of war, and that's what Putin's taking advantage of when he's talking about denazifying a place like Ukraine. We mentioned it last time, and I had reported on this group of neo-Nazis in Ukraine for years, long before this, because they started when Russia first took over Crimea and the war began in eastern Ukraine. This Azov regiment, this Azov battalion absolutely exists. They are real. They are there. They fight as part of Ukraine's army, but they make up what? Maybe its entire support group makes up less than 2% of the country. They exist, but that doesn't mean the country is neo-Nazi. Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, diverse democracy with a Jewish president right now. This is complete, utter nonsense. But that doesn't mean there isn't an Azov regiment in Ukraine that should be watched out, because let's just say Ukraine is very successful. They get the end result of some sort of peace treaty. Okay, let's say they get that. You have the issue right now that an Azov regiment would stand as a hero at that point. They were part of the defense system in Ukraine. They stood their ground in places like Mariupol, which is their stronghold, which is the city that's being utterly destroyed right now. Horrific war crimes and abuses going on there right now. If they stand their ground there, they'll be seen as heroes. But here's the key distinction there. First of all, there has been very little foreign recruitment that I have seen into the Azov battalion, because I've been tracking this right now, very little, despite articles in the Washington Post, etc., saying otherwise. I disagree flat out right now that I'm not seeing any sort of movement like that or growth of the troops. And what you really will see at the end is, I think people will relate to them not because of the Nazi ideology, but because of the nationalism aspect in the end of the day. So I don't think the Azov have the stronghold that people might expect, or the people who are buying into Putin's propaganda expect at all. At the end of the day, this is an element that Putin is absolutely utilizing, which is also why he's really targeting Mariupol. Apart from it being a land route into Crimea, it's also what is seen as the Azov stronghold. So if he absolutely brings it to its knees, well, that's a big success for his country and his idea of denazifying Ukraine, which is part of what Kadyrov is doing. All his messages right now about targeting these Azovs and targeting Ukraine and targeting the Nazis and the Banderas and all these groups, they're picking out every single piece of propaganda they can find and spinning it around. And anyone who's trying to discuss this right now is not, you're in the state of fog of war, which is what we're in right now, unfortunately, with information warfare from both ends. There's very little room for nuance, unfortunately. I'm trying to lay it out as simply as possible here that yes, there's a little group of them that exists in Ukraine. Yes, there's something we should absolutely be watching out for, but no, this does not define the country. This does not at all support Putin's absolute utter propaganda, and also ignores the fact that there's countless fascists and neo-Nazis in Russia as well. As a matter of fact, they're so connected. The Azov regiment happily works with other Russian neo-Nazis. They have no interest in either side of this whole thing, in that narrative. And there's plenty. The amount of neo-Nazis that are active in Russia right now, from men's rights groups that are actual literal neo-Nazis to these fight clubs that I've been covering for a long time, all very active in Russia still. So Putin's whole denazification thing is complete, utter nonsense. Let's just settle it there. But as of what's going to happen next, it's very difficult to see a clear way through. At the end of the day, I'm sticking to this denazification point because it is still one of the big criterias of their negotiations right now. That the idea that we must denazify Ukraine, well, they're arguing based on the logic of their propaganda that doesn't exist. How do you proceed from there? How do you proceed from there? And so unfortunately, we've seen examples of this with the far right in the United States, etc. This is the way these discussions and these arguments go, which is why when I see, progressives and liberals and whatnot, and just intellectuals in general say, I'll debate anybody, and I'm sure if I sit long enough, I'll be able to convince them. No, because they're not even on the same playing field as you. They're in a and if they are, they're taking the goalposts and just consistently moving them around for fun. They're not trying to have a reasonable discussion. That's exactly what Putin's doing right now. On a global war crime scale, he's trolling, and that's disgusting.
Oh my,
Do you think, excuse me, Nancy,
yeah.
do you think that the Russian influence on American media and American politics has had, I mean, that's the reason that the sanctions coming from this side, the sanctions that we're trying to impose are so ineffective?
That's an interesting point.
I mean, I'm just, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'd say the Russian influence on American media has had a clear effect on sort of building up elements of the far right that exists right now in the United States, which is why you're seeing people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, etc., being very sort of, at this point right now, wouldn't go so far as Putin propagandists, but very close. I mean, Candace Owens absolutely flat out Putin propagandists, pushing the idea that Ukraine didn't even have a national identity before 1989. That's a great example of Russian disinformation making its way to the United States, influencing far-right elements that go back and reinforce it and spread that message around to an American audience, which then is like, well, you know what? Putin might not be so bad, and he might not be so wrong after all. So yeah, that element definitely plays out. As to the sanctions, though, I think the sanctions, you have the biggest concern will go beyond disinformation and into actual corruption. And that's always the problem, is that when you really dig deep enough to see who needs to be sanctioned, you start to realize that everybody's hands are dirty. Which is why I go back to when I'm saying the UK requiring sanctioning certain Russians, but the fact is a lot of that money is actually in London right now. Like, how do you actually disentangle yourself from that? Very simply, it's not that simple. It's also why it took them so long to sanction Roman Abramovich. Sanctions are a difficult thing because it's a pill to swallow for everybody, not just for the people being sanctioned. Because you're starting to realize that, oh no, a lot of our major corporations and a lot of our higher ups and all these people actually have ties to all these entities. How do we disconnect from that and still make our money and still stay afloat? So yeah, I think that's still going to be our main problem when it comes to sanctions.
I have a question that's not a follow-up, and it's kind of a departure, and I'm sorry about that. But when we're talking about individual athletes, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the Brittany Griner situation. Is it Griner? Did I say her name right? I'm sorry, I don't follow basketball either, so I'm always a little bit behind on that. But what your thoughts were on that? I know, I think it's David Zirin released an article about her today, which I haven't caught up on my reading today. So, but I just wanted your thoughts on that situation.
Anything David Zirin puts out is absolute must read. So I didn't know he did one. I absolutely intend on reading it afterwards. I was about to say that there isn't much enough information really to make sort of to have really a very in-depth analysis. So I'll try and just lay out a few potentials that I think are happening here. Either this is a case of really Cold War attempt of diplomacy, and Russia actually, trying to utilize this idea that we're going to hang on to this person as sort of this bargaining chip, which I think would be very odd, because why would they target a female basketball player in that case? That I thought was a bit odd, because you could have targeted, and especially in Russia's eyes, they will never compare a female athlete to a man, to an athlete competing in men's sports, etc. That's just the unfortunate truth. They have picked the biggest star they could potentially find. But apart from that, it still leaves it as a potential right there. The other real option, the other real thing I find very concerning is how little coverage there's been of it. It goes to show you that just women's sports still is not respected in the same way, and is not taken as seriously. The fact that this is not considered a actual national issue that needs to be dealt with, that should be something should be addressed in a White House press briefing, for instance. This is something that these questions should be asked. There's currently a U.S. citizen who is one of the best basketball players in the world who is stuck in Russia and is still, I think as of a couple of days ago, was refused bail, etc., and is still is still being held in detention. As far as I understand, that's the whole situation.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, her trial is not just was announced. It will be in May.
So Russia does that a lot. It's a trick Egypt loves as well, is that they delay pre-trial detention as much as possible, and they'll consistently do that. Whilst in the US, you might have it move a lot faster. In Russia, and I know in Egypt as well, and I mean, I guess these guys learn from each other, really, is pre-trial detention can take years. I doubt it will in this case, but I have seen pre-trial detention take up to years.
But again, what you're saying, if there was a major basketball player, male, who was treated there would be upcry. There would be.
Exactly. And that's
So
pathetic, really. It's
it is.
absolutely pathetic. And something, again, that's one of the issues. Like you'd say, we as Western countries or Western media or whatever, that's an issue we need to address, truly.
And do you also think that there's something about, because Brittany, her wife is Russian, but she was back in the US. Is there something also maybe with kind of, I know that homosexuality is something that Putin, looks down on. And I'm curious if that was also a target on her, for her.
Yeah, honestly, nothing at this point would surprise me. But what does actually surprise me is why all this effort and concern over Brittany Griner right now during this ongoing conflict that's, in terms of the military campaign itself, the war on the ground itself, from what we understand, is not going so well for Putin right now. Sure, he's absolutely crushing certain cities and bombarding them. Let's not put that aside, the fact that there are countless people dying in horrific ways right now. But in terms of the advancements he was expecting, that's not what's occurring on the ground. There's actually been some phenomenal articles in the Financial Times, etc., looking at that in depth. So given that, and given that his priority should be in that direction, what's going on here? I don't understand. And also there has been no attempt, as I understand, unless there's some sort of backdoor communication that we're not aware of, and that's also possible. I'm very confused as to why there is either no open outward diplomacy that we're seeing, why there isn't more reporting on this, why isn't the whole thing, I still find to be very confusing, which is why I'm not able to come up with a firm conclusion here.
No, I think that, this whole idea of negotiating, I think that, Russia and Ukraine, I think Russia wants Crimea. They probably, could maybe, to save face for Putin, they need like the eastern half. And I'm sure Ukraine is not going to accept that. But so here's the difference, with this war as well. We have to bring up that they're getting closer to Poland. They're getting closer to NATO countries. I'm going to ask you again, Kareem. Do you think Putin would invade a NATO country?
I honestly cannot remember what my answer was last time. If we had this, I'm going to go off what I think at this very moment. I have always believed that Putin's main intention has been his empire, the Russian Empire. It's been rebuilding or reconstructing, reaffirming, whatever term you'd like, really, the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire really, one of its old elements, at least at once upon a time, an old history really, is Ukraine as well. His focus is really on taking Ukraine and incorporating it into Russia. Traversing really deeper into Europe doesn't seem like the old Russian Empire, personally. Again, we're dealing with exceptional times here, and I'm not quite sure what happens next, but for me, Putin has always been about empire. It's always been about recreating, at the very least, what he had in the Soviet times. But I think he preferred the Russia even before the Soviet times, really, like the actual Russian Empire. He believes that all these places belong to Russia, or at least under Russian influence and control.
Yeah.
That's what he means by neutral. When he wants a country to be neutral, he still wants it to be leaning towards Russia at the end of the day. So I think his concern right now is Ukraine. What goes on beyond Ukraine will be anyone's guess for right now. But this idea that we can make simple comparisons back to 1939, I think it's never, first of all, I think it's never a good idea to make a Hitler comparison. It's just there's no point. Let that be its own piece of history, and let that be its own horrific atrocity in history. The idea that this is simply an idea we're going to keep letting him traverse further into Europe, I don't think that's the case. I think that he is looking to take back what he sees as something that belongs to Russia. Mind you, that's what he did with Chechnya. Chechnya had declared independence in 1991. Then Yeltsin takes power and he decides, okay, one of the first things I'm going to do as a campaign is try and take Chechnya. And he got lots of support from Clinton at the time and from other Western countries to say, all right, this is how we're going to reestablish Russia, Russia. And they go and they destroy Chechnya, and then they try and subjugate Chechnya. Yeltsin failed, mind you, because in 1996, after 50,000 Chechens died, they still managed to get a de facto state and signed a peace treaty with Yeltsin. It was a complete, utter failure for the Russian army and for Russia overall. And this is its first defeat right after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was just like a horrible defeat at a horrible time for Russia. Then comes Putin, who takes power by targeting this Chechnya and then basically rising through this populist wave that comes through this fervent demand that he destroy and tame these savages in Chechnya, right? And bring them back under Russian control. And once he was able to do that, he becomes president of Russia because he was prime minister when he first bombed Chechnya. He wasn't even president yet. Through the support that came with this military victory in Chechnya, he rose to the presidency thereafter. So it goes to show his targets have always been what he believed are places that belong to Russia. Since Chechnya was part of Russia since 1859, well, how dare you declare independence? I want you back. You're mine.
Yeah.
The same mentality applies to Ukraine.
So this is very good, and you also bring up that Putin is someone who is also in his own head, an own world as well. And I have to bring up nuclear, because I think that's another thing that's making this such a charged situation. And a lot of people are putting out that Putin, he's already a war criminal. He's already kind of lost a lot of the yes men around him, or I mean, that's, I think, the idea of the invading a NATO country or something. What is your thoughts on that?
The nuclear option is always going to be there, unfortunately. Can I just say that immediately you asking that question reminds me of the fact that, first of all, I was on an HBO documentary in 2017 covering Ramzan Kadyrov and his MMA fight clubs, etc. Funny enough, when journalist David Scott went to Chechnya to interview Ramzan Kadyrov, all he really talked to him about was his fight club. That's really, and I think he asked one question about the purge of LGBTQ plus people in Chechnya. Like, those were the topics that he covered, and he stuck to those topics. I've seen the transcript, I've seen the whole thing. Yet somehow, while he's asking questions about the fight club, Kadyrov responds with this claim that if Russia is ever attacked, it will launch its nukes automatically and bring the world to its knees. This is what he chose to say off a conversation that had nothing to do with nukes. And it's in the documentary. Everyone who goes back to watch the documentary, it's one of the final sections of the documentary. As a matter of fact, Kadyrov's PR people, one of his ministers, I think he calls him the Minister of Press and Information, is which, I mean, goodness me, what's an oxymoron for a Chechen minister. But he's been putting out little clips of that exact section, pushing them around like that. They're using it as propaganda now. They're proud of it and they use it as propaganda. But that's Kadyrov. Kadyrov is known for that type of propaganda, and Putin and Russia rely on him to spread this kind of propaganda. It's this idea that the Chechens are these ferocious warriors, and at the same time, Kadyrov is just looking at the West and saying, deal us your best shot. We have a response plan. That's what Kadyrov is saying. You don't hear Putin say that directly. You don't hear that necessarily say it outright the way Ramzan Kadyrov will. He's definitely not going to say we'll bring the world to its knees straight away, especially not off a conversation off a fight club. But it goes to show you that this narrative is there in Russian politics. This is a leading Russian politician, whether we like it or not. He's a dictatorial, horrific warlord, but he's still the head of Chechnya, which makes him a Russian politician.
Yeah.
This is a statement coming from an official Russian politician. I think it tells you the state of affairs that we're in right now. And considering the fact that apparently some of the main American intelligence that actually came about this war emerged from the fact that Ramzan Kadyrov was spreading voice memos to his soldiers and telling them how to prepare for the war, those memos get leaked and that's how the information got out in the first place. Is that, at least that's what the word that's going around right now. So Kadyrov is a liability in so many ways to Putin, but he's also this great propaganda figure and this ferocious leader. So you've got this, back and forth with him. And I think the nuke comments is one that could go either way, really. It could be something Putin didn't want out there, or something that Putin smiles and is like, great, he said it instead of me.
Yeah. No, and I think I saw that a Russian official who's with their space program has even said that they can direct the Russian space station down into Europe. So
yeah, unfortunately, you're going to hear stuff like that. He surrounds himself by yes men, and there's no room for people other than that. We've heard Putin just say a few days ago that Russia is in a state where it needs to cleanse itself and cleanse its people. And that's a way to basically outing traitors. That's what they want to do right now. This idea that if you're not like us, if you're not with us, if you're not for this war, you're a traitor and you don't belong here. That's a horrific way. Any society, any country that turns into a homogenous place like that, nothing good comes from that. That is pure fascism, pure utter fascism.
Wow. No.
If I could ask you a question to sort of tie it back to sports with, this fairly, dramatic removal of Russia from the World Cup and from these international Olympic bodies. But given your description of Russia, do you see events that could take place that would justify bringing them back into those organizations? And if we don't bring Russia back into those organizations, what do you see as the future of those organizations going forward? Can they exist with excluding a country like Russia?
That's an excellent point. And it's a great question. I think where no one has really addressed it yet because we haven't gotten that far, unfortunately. We're in a stage right now where people are still trying to terminate relationships with Russia. But no, this is a very valid question. I'd like to think about this right now. Let's say, well, the truth is it's contextually based, right? So it depends on the context of things. What really is going to bring, what is the world expecting here? What kind of peace is the world expecting? And at what point are people going to be ready to welcome Russia back in? Those are factors that I don't think I am an expert enough really to address right here. But I can say that let's talk in grand generalizations here and say some form of peace treaty emerges and a change of leadership occurs in Russia, that is. I think that's a key. I think those are terms we can talk in. If Putin remains president, I think it's going to be very hard for international events to take place in Russia because we know how Putin utilizes sports. Mm-hmm. We know he has a long history from the days when he was doing judo instructional videos and presenting himself as this hyper-masculine man. And in the days of riding around on horses, like bare-chested and presenting himself as this healthy leader, which Russians did believe. This propaganda did work. So you cannot give him any opportunities. But a change of leadership and a change in direction, once again, or knowing that the war is over, those are the things where you slowly start to welcome Russia back in. Because you're going to have to. You can't be international bodies while separating the world like this. But we're at extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, and that's what's happening right now. But first of all, excluding the athletes, how long are you going to actually exclude athletes? I think it all depends on what's happening with the war. I think a lot of people had this expectation that this was going to be over by now. Unfortunately, the sad truth is that's not how war works. That's just not how war works. Even right now, I can say now, there's civil war going on in different places. There's war between nations going on in different places right now, and none of it ends in a few days or a few weeks. It just doesn't. Egypt once had a war with Israel that ended in, 6 days, I think? But those things, that happens, once in 100 years, maybe? Unfortunately, it's going to really depend on the outcome of the war, and it's going to depend on what happens next in Russia and how much change we actually see in Russia. And that's a terrible thought, because to think that it could be years before Russia's integrated into the world properly again, even through just sports, the kind of damage that does to an individual country when it's isolated to that extent, that only does more damage to us in the long term, and that's problematic as well. So I hope it doesn't take that long. But again, I think the priority right now, rather than thinking of reintegrating sports in Russia, is thinking of how to end the war. And once that happens, I think that's an excellent question. And we're going to have to start thinking about that, I think.
Yeah. We have a question from my class. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes.
Where you're from?
Hi, I'm Gabby. I'm from DC, Northern Virginia. I just have a random question. I am not an international studies major whatsoever. But I was wondering, in terms of now Russia invading Ukraine, if that's triggering other countries. Now, for example, people are talking about how China is going to invade Taiwan in 2 weeks, so to say. But is that something that's going to occur with other countries and influencing other countries to, invade others?
I unfortunately, how the world reacts to this will determine how other authoritarian leaders will be able to proceed in the future. You've seen that this hasn't stopped the UAE and Saudi Arabia from dropping bombs on Yemen in the past few days. They've seen this as an opportunity. As a matter of fact, the world is completely distracted right now. But the idea that there are time frames for China and Taiwan, I'd ignore the time frames, but always leave the concern that this is going to happen, unfortunately, because China is absolutely watching how everything plays out in the world, it's watching every single sanction. It's focusing on how the world is handling this to know how it's going to defend itself, how it's going to protect itself economically, and what its limitations are in terms of how it can approach these things. But again, I am also not an expert necessarily on international relations, but speaking as someone who has studied authoritarian regimes and dictators, they absolutely keep an eye on each other. And depending on who is in charge in the global hegemony, being either in the global hegemonic stage right now, and a lot of that is the United States, that factors into how they react. I mean, under Trump, unfortunately, I still believe that a lot of the damage Trump caused, that while he caused plenty of damage in the United States, a lot of what he really did was enabling authoritarians around the world. For instance, he called Egypt's military dictator Sisi his favorite dictator, and Sisi absolutely loved that. He absolutely loved it. And we had horrible year of human rights abuses in Egypt at the time, arresting people without any issues. As a matter of fact, under Biden, despite the fact that Biden hasn't really taken any harsh steps against Sisi, the fact that he is considered a democratic leader in that sense, Sisi has still had to sort of release certain key prominent imprisoned people from jail in Egypt, just to ensure that the military budget that America dedicates to Egypt still arrives in one piece, which they rely on. So authoritarians absolutely watch out for this, whether in wartime or in peacetime.
Very good question. Oh, can you come up here? We have another question. Thank you for. And if you give your name. Where you're from.
I'm Lucas. I'm from Pennsylvania, right outside Philly. For better or for worse, a lot of the time, at least in the past, like the Olympics and a lot of international competition has been a way for countries to put aside their differences and sort of not unite, but friendly competition. How do you think this specifically? Because we're seeing a lot more like Russia not being able to compete in certain events. Do you think this is going to become like a long-term option for like diplomatic relations?
What is going to be a long-term option?
Like removing countries from international like athletic events.
It is a weak option at this stage, but it is what is available right now, and it's what's available on short notice as well, right? A country like Russia should have been handled properly for its doping allegations long before what's happened right now on the world stage. Right now, this is barely a reaction. At the end of the day, I feel actually quite sorry for the Paralympic athletes that are the only ones that got the brunt of this. At the end of the day, the Russian athletes that represented Putin have already gotten their medals from Putin after returning from the Olympics anyway. So he's already gotten everything he needed from that display. But the truth is, I think from the very beginning, the understanding that the Olympics is this time for countries to come together and put aside their differences and ignore politics is absolute myth, in my opinion. That has never been the standing of the Olympic Games, not from when it was set up originally in ancient times, nor the modern Olympics. And unfortunately, as we've seen throughout history, including modern history, like the 1936 Olympics, which Hitler hosted specifically to prove Aryan supremacy. That is not countries being brought together. That's not uniting countries. That's presenting ideology and propaganda. And the IOC has been so complicit in this for so many years that there's very little they can do at this point to redeem themselves, truly.
We're actually, the next class is coming in. Does anyone else have any last minute talks? Thank you so much, Kareem, everyone. Enlighten on these points. It's just going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yes.
I would love to touch base with you. Who knows where the world will be in 3 months?
So true. So true.
Thank you for sharing. I really have new thoughts on all of these things. And especially, this is a really big, the cell phone war too, in terms of how that's going to play out. And it's also going to be interesting with the financial restrictions in Russia, as we've seen when fighting is made to be banned, or something like the underground corruption world might get bigger. So,
as it did in the 90s in Russia.
Yes. So, this has been so enlightening, and thank you so much, Kareem.
My pleasure.
Julie, happy birthday again.
Yes, happy
Um,
birthday, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
But everyone, please check out, what is your latest article on? It just went up on Bloody Elbow.
Yes, it's an article about how the UFC still has ties to Gazprom Media, actually, which we were talking about today. Gazprom and Gazprom Media. It has a Russian broadcast deal with Gazprom, despite the fact that everybody else has suspended and terminated those deals. And this specific deal, it has ties to a propaganda network. So it's a short article, it's a quick news piece, but I thought it was worth posting.
No,
Thank you.
and I also recommend that HBO Real Sports, we all watched it in our class. And I cannot believe that Kadyrov is using that, or other politicians are using that for their own, but such a
That was-
well done.
That was
documentary.
5 years ago. That was 5 years ago. There's so much to update. Like I sometimes talk to David and we talk about how part 2 is necessary at this point.
No, I think so. Thank you, Kareem. Have a good weekend. Thank you so much. It's been so helpful.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Best birthday present ever. Thank you, Kareem.
Bye.